For 10 long years, Alexandra Pierce treated Xavier Walker's tiny shop as a free dumping ground for every busted engine her massive corporation simply tossed aside. Like clockwork, every single month, a delivery truck backed in, dropping cracked blocks and scorched copper windings and twisted crankshafts. The suits up top sent a clear message: this struggling single dad only deserved their scrap metal and corporate failures. But Xavier never complained once. He studied every broken bolt, learned from their mistakes, and raised his little girl with grease-stained hands. Until one brutal summer, when every single motor her company built suddenly died. Stick with me right here, because we're about to see how a decade of discarded junk held the one secret that could rescue their entire failing industry. Mornings in Toledo, Ohio always reeked of heavy diesel. That smell soaked right into the concrete and rusty fences, into the tough bark of whatever trees dared to grow between the old factories and dead train tracks that sliced the east side like deep scars on a mechanic's tired arms. Xavier Walker's shop sat right on the edge of town, a small cinder block joint whose hydraulic lift constantly leaked red transmission fluid, and a simple hand-painted sign above. The shop door read Walker Garage in letters bleached out to dirty gray. He was 29 when that Pierce Industrial Motors delivery truck first rolled up. He looked exactly like a quiet guy who had fully made peace with scraping a decent living from what the rich tossed away. His shop tools were old and mismatched, yet hung with dead-on surgical precision. A solid steel workbench stretched across the entire back wall. Battered and oil-stained, sure, but flawlessly level. He spent 3 hours with wooden shims the day he bolted it, tucked quietly in the back corner, under an old crooked lamp casting a soft, warm pool of yellow light. 6-year-old Grace Walker sat on an empty oil drum, quietly doing her math homework. Her pencil scratched the paper, matching the steady, working-class rhythm of her dad slowly ratcheting a stubborn engine bolt nearby. That corporate truck backed right in uninvited. 3 dead engines rolled off the flatbed on a jack, slammed onto the concrete, the kind of careless drop rich folks use for things they consider totally worthless. The board driver muttered about clearing factory floor space, called them failed engineering test units, and told Xavier he could keep the heavy scrap metal for free. He shoved over a release paper, never once meeting his eyes. Later, some executive named Connor Hayes called from their fancy uptown offices, his voice dripping with that smug arrogance of a guy who thinks a mahogany desk makes him better than us. He casually mentioned that CEO Alexandra Pierce hated paying dump fees when there was a cheap garage sitting at the edge of town that actually liked getting its hands dirty with dead machines. He said dead like it meant garbage, but you and I know what the suits call dead is really just a lesson. Xavier held the phone in his yard, staring at those 3 engines resting on his oil-stained concrete. He stayed quiet. Naturally, the suit assumed it was dumb gratitude. But what Xavier truly felt down deep was pure professional curiosity. He circled the motors slowly, dropping low to study the ruined cylinder heads. I ran my thumbnail along a jagged crack in the biggest engine block. The scorch marks on that first motor's windings were completely lopsided, meaning the heat stress had been totally unbalanced. That wasn't bad luck, it was a flawed engineering design. Engine 2 showed slanted wear on the bearings, proving it was knocked out of alignment under heavy pressure. The third machine showed heavy rust along the oil lines. The metal walls proved their factory coolant mixture was calibrated all wrong. Tuned for perfect lab testing, not for how these industrial engines actually worked out in the real world. I wasn't just staring at 3 busted chunks of metal. I was reading the failure reports that a massive corporation simply refused to look at. I threw a heavy canvas tarp over them that night. My daughter Grace climbed off an old drum, asking why people dumped trash on us. I told her that just because someone throws it away doesn't mean it's junk. Sometimes, I told her, it is just waiting for someone patient enough to really listen. Alexandra Pierce took over the CEO job from her dad 8 years before those delivery trucks found my lot. She was 41 when this whole mess started. Cold, confident, the type of boss who walked into a room acting like she already owned the future. Pierce Industrial Motors was a legendary Midwestern giant. They built massive diesel and electric motors for giant power generation setups, big rigs, mining gear, and gigantic industrial pump networks. Under her dad, the brand was famous for precision engineering and raw, stubborn toughness. But under Alexandra, they only cared about stock prices, market share, and flashy updates. She believed the future belonged to corporations bold enough to completely ignore the past. She trusted expensive consultants and fancy computer simulations. She relied on her corporate board and their neat quarterly spreadsheets. She had zero respect for gut feelings or hands-on experience. And she certainly wouldn't listen to a mechanic running a tiny shop wedged between dead train tracks and an old silo. She never even glanced at my garage when her fancy car drove past. I hadn't always worked by myself. 7 years before my daughter arrived, I pulled maintenance duty at a huge local steel mill. I was the guy who could hear a bad bearing, starting to grind 2 full days before the computer noticed. I could walk a loud factory floor and feel exactly which pump was about to blow just from the vibration. The other guys called it magic. I just called it listening. Then my wife Renee got sick with a brutal brain disease. She fought that awful condition for almost 3 years. She faced it with this stubborn grace, completely refusing to let failing muscles define who she was. But right around Grace's 2nd birthday, the sickness got too fast for us to hide anymore. When Renee slipped away on a bitterly cold February morning, the ice literally cracked the old windows of our house. I shoved my entire factory career into one rusty toolbox and opened my own shop. I desperately needed flexible hours. I had to be the one making Grace's lunch, waiting at the nurse's office during a fever, and sitting by her bed whenever a bad dream woke her up. That dirty garage offered him a grounded reality no shift job ever could. He fixed whatever broken farm equipment rolled through those heavy doors. Battered diesel trucks, backup generators for local factories. The gritty machines folks couldn't afford to send to a shiny dealership for a bloated repair estimate. His garage walls were absolutely plastered with worn notebooks. Not cheap motivational posters, just stacked notebooks, dozens and dozens of them. Every single spine labeled with dates in thick black marker. Inside, Xavier's meticulous handwriting tracked the exact operating temperatures and daily records. Real oil pressures, vibration signatures, metal fatigue patterns, and failure sequences. The hard truth of why specific engine parts shattered under heavy real-world stress. When a scrapped engine arrived from Pearson Industrial Motors, it got a number and a dedicated chapter in his growing archive. Xavier never rushed to sell the scrap. He tore down every unit methodically, photographing each component first, measuring clearances, noting exactly which parts died first and which survived the longest. He quietly built something he didn't even have a name for. A massive database of genuine real-world failure, sourced from heavy machinery run hard by folks who couldn't afford to be gentle, pushed to limits no fancy corporate engineering simulation could ever dream of replicating. His daughter Grace grew up bathed in that garage's dim amber light. She finished her daily homework right beside crated engine blocks. She memorized complex mechanical parts the way other kids learned their favorite cartoon characters. She understood from a very early age that her working father was built completely different from those comfortable fathers in suburban driveways. Never lesser but far quieter in his hard-earned dignity. He carried a heavy inner truth, refusing to let the arrogant corporate world diminish his worth. You and I know guys like this. He raised her on blunt, unshakable principles. He taught her that working-class people simply couldn't afford to be careless, because reckless mistakes were a heavy tax only the wealthy could absorb. He warned her never to let outsiders assign her value, because the comfortable suits doing the assigning were always just protecting their own. And he reminded her, time after time, that mastering failure creates success. A person grinding quietly holds real power, the kind an arrogant executive with a flawed product can never fully strip away. Corporate suit Connor Hayes dumped fresh scrap loads every few months initially, then way more frequently as Pearson Industrial Motors recklessly rushed their production cycles. The corporate release forms he shoved over became increasingly formal, heavily packed with dense legal jargon covering liability and strict ownership transfers. He dismissively called Xavier's shop a junkyard in a voicemail. Xavier saved it, but not from bitterness. He kept it because that blind corporate contempt was clarifying. It proved exactly what the executives thought, that they were handing him worthless trash. which meant those suits had absolutely no idea what he was quietly building. Madison Reed, a sharp mechanical engineer 6 years deep into her Pierce career, had caught whispers about this scrap arrangement from a guy running fleet logistics. She actually flagged this recurring breakdown pattern once during an internal meeting. Let's be real. She correctly argued that tracking broken scrap offered massive engineering value. Naturally, Connor arrogantly dismissed the whole idea in a single shallow breath. They brushed off those failed units as just early production glitches, moving right along to their next board meeting. Up in corporate, Madison scribbled down a warning she actually kept. 10 years into my little arrangement, they rolled out a brand new engine. Pierce Industrial Motors launched their PIM-X series with a massive press event at headquarters, packed with big transit fleets, mining crews and local utility bosses, plus some trade reporter ready to paint CEO Alexandra Pierce as one of the most powerful manufacturing bosses in the whole industrial sector. This new PIM-X was built purely for peak performance, lighter parts and cranked-up compression, razor-thin engineering margins, cooling systems based on fancy fluid dynamics that their engineers proudly called the very smartest piece of tech they had ever built. Sure, the engines looked incredible on paper, spec sheets so perfect you could frame them. Alexandra stood up at that podium, preaching about the future of heavy industry. She had that blind confidence of someone who never had to sweep up their own mistakes. I watched absolutely none of it. I was in my garage that morning tearing down a PIM-X prototype that had landed in my scrap pile with a bunch of other failed test motors, weeks before their big launch. You and I know better. I already found 3 fatal flaws completely missing from their paperwork. The main oil return channel was 17% too narrow for what the heat actually demanded during heavy use, meaning when things got really hot, that burning oil would pool up, never circulating, setting off a chain reaction failure that their clean little bench tests would never catch, but would utterly destroy the motor in the field. Their crankshaft metal was tough, sure, but too brittle at certain frequencies perfectly matching the vibrations of rough roads and factory floors. And their cooling system was built for perfectly clean air and nice mild weather, not for the filthy, dust-choked jobs where this motor would actually spend its life. I logged every single flaw in my notebook, tagged the broken unit, and shelved those secrets beside 10 years of identical ignored warnings. There was one late night when my daughter Grace was 16 that neither of us will ever forget. I had spent 8 brutal months building what I called my stabilizer assembly, a backup oil and heat control rig that I figured could be slapped right onto the PIM-X block to fix every failure trap I had found. It wasn't exactly pretty engineering. It was survival engineering, cobbled together from pure scrap metal, zip-tied to the engine block in a way that would make those corporate designers sick. But stick with me here, it gave that engine exactly what it actually needed to survive, not what some shiny blueprint assumed. Late one freezing Saturday night in November, Grace and I finally fired up the finished rig on a scrap motor in my shop. She perched on a stool with her clipboard, eyes glued to the temp gauge, shouting numbers. The block roared to life, held for 40 seconds, then started knocking like crazy. It died with a noise like a bag of bolts kicked down a staircase. Grace just looked crushed. I crouched by the broken engine, listening to that heavy silence, and just smiled. I promised her the engine knock was softer than before. You and I know failure isn't useless, not when it tells you exactly where to look. By the time spring rolled around, my cooling oil stabilizer finally existed in a version that actually ran right. I didn't patent it, announce it, or post it anywhere. I just started installing my fix into the broken motors brought to my own garage. Those PIM-X engines where the big corporate dealers had turned the owners away. They blamed the hard-working operators, handing out repair quotes that cost more than the machine itself. A mommy freight crew hauled in 2 completely busted PIM-X motors. The corporate guys at Pierce outright refused to cover either machine under warranty. I rebuilt the blocks, fitted my stabilizer, and gave them right back. 8 months later, both of those engines kept running perfectly. News spread the way it always does down here among blue-collar folks. Not through fancy marketing, just the incredibly specific Honest pipeline of one working guy telling a buddy that a local mechanic actually fixed the problem. Up in the glass towers, Madison Reed heard about my fix at a fancy lunch. She quietly pulled the service logs from that mommy's shipping outfit. She must have read it twice that Tuesday, sitting frozen at her spotless executive desk. Look, those PIMX failures didn't happen overnight. They grew the way disaster always does, quietly, deep beneath the polished metal, hiding right in that blind spot between fancy sensor readings and an engine struggling under real strain. The very first serious warning signs came from a Pennsylvania trucking crew. They lost 11 engines across their working fleet during the very first year alone. The corporate suits just blamed the truckers, claiming they skipped routine oil changes. Then, a West Virginia mining outfit reported completely destroyed bearings inside 3 heavy diesel generators, keeping their underground tunnels breathing. Their lawyers fired back, sending a formal notice of critical engine failure. A Michigan water plant logged a massive cooling pump breakdown that urgently required an emergency shutdown of their secondary treatment line, sparking a massive regulatory nightmare that buried 2 state agencies in endless compliance paperwork. Every single time, Connor Hayes up in corporate produced slick excuses that pinned the blame firmly on the customer. Wrong oil used, bad installation, pushing the machines way too hard. You see, those excuses weren't totally fabricated. They just conveniently ignored the core design flaws, making those motors so vulnerable to exactly the everyday wear and tear that real industrial work naturally caused. Back in the boardroom, Madison finished her deep investigation the very next spring. 41 pages long, it proved the exact same mechanical pattern I was seeing. This wasn't just careless operator error, but a repeating signature of dangerous heat buildup, plunging oil pressure, and rapidly grinding bearings. She'd found metal scrap in those filters, clear proof of a design flaw, not operator error. She pushed her findings right through their internal engineering review. Connor Hayes kicked it back. His only note claimed her sample size was too small for broad conclusions. 3 months later, she tried again, bringing a much larger set of data. That time, Connor pulled her straight into his office, using that arrogant tone of a boss who thinks a fancy title lets him dictate the truth. He warned her she was hurting morale by chasing a theory the executives had already tossed out. Madison brought that rejected report home that night. She refused to throw it away. Then came the public humiliation in September. Pearson Industrial Motors threw a massive press launch for their PIMX Titan. A flashy redesign of the old series their marketing team claimed had fixed all customer complaints with next-generation engineering and rugged durability. They hosted the whole circus right in their main manufacturing bay, decked out for the cameras with glaring spotlights and fancy stands. They had a catered spread that cost more than I made in an entire month. I saw wealthy investors, local journalists, and 3 stuffy university engineering reps, plus a bunch of massive account clients the failing company desperately needed to keep. Madison had spent 2 solid weeks arguing with herself. A week prior, she finally called me. Her voice was shaking as she asked if I'd be willing to show up there as a technical consultant, a guy with actual field experience fixing those failed engines in the dirt. I told her absolutely not. But my 17-year-old daughter Grace, with her mother's cheekbones and my tired eyes, looked at me across our cramped kitchen table and insisted I needed to go. Not for revenge, she told me, just to make them face what they blindly ignored. I showed up wearing my absolute cleanest work jacket, an old green canvas coat, washed until the elbows went soft. I still had a stubborn dark line of motor grease ground into my knuckles that never fully washed out. Didn't matter how hard I scrubbed my hands. Grace walked right in beside me. Connor Hayes spotted me across the room. His face flashed through sheer panic and confusion in half a second before finally locking into pure, ugly contempt. He marched straight over and told me, right in front of wealthy investors and a pair of listening journalists, that this launch was closed to vendors and his CEO didn't need any uninvited input, especially from a guy making a living by digging through their industrial trash. Alexandra Pierce stood by the main stage, holding a glass and projecting fake corporate confidence. She recognized me a moment later. She'd actually visited my garage 4 years back, signing off a massive transfer of her broken, failed engine series. I remember her staring at my organized shelves. Looking over my piles of stripped parts, she'd made a snide comment about my talent for building a whole life out of other people's failures. She probably thought she was paying me a compliment. I sure didn't take it that way. Now she quietly stated that a premium product launch wasn't the place for a mechanic from the salvage trade. The massive room didn't fall totally dead silent, but nearby chatter completely stopped. Grace stood perfectly still beside me. Her jaw was clenched tight, eyes flashing with something much harder than tears. Look, Madison was just 3 feet away from me, feeling the floor of the event hall tilt beneath her. It was a subtle shift you could only understand if you had spent 2 long years begging a stubborn corporation to fix a flaw they blindly ignored. I didn't raise my voice at all. I didn't step toward Alexandra or back away. I just stared at their flagship Titan engine, gleaming on its illuminated exhibition platform. Polished up, its spec placard claiming maximum power output numbers that I knew were fake. I'd watched those same stats crumble in my own shop. So I asked Alexandra, keeping my tone low enough for just the executives standing nearby, if this new Titan generator actually fixed the primary oil return diameter from the original design. I kept it quiet. But the engineering flaw was too specific for corporate PR to just brush aside. Connor instantly killed the conversation, and 2 guys in event security uniforms grabbed my elbows within seconds. They marched me toward the exit, moving fast like they already had a protocol for this. Right before they threw me out, Alexandra spoke her final words to me. She said she had gifted me the trashed engines from her company's past failures, and I shouldn't mistake her charity for actual engineering knowledge about how real working motors were built. I didn't say anything. I just kept walking toward the exit, steady and completely unhurried. Right at the exit, I stopped and caught Madison staring from the crowd. I leaned over and whispered so only she could hear me. I told her if that Titan machine used the same flawed oil architecture and bearing specs as the original, it would never fail in lab testing. It was going to fail out in the real world, right when innocent people needed it most. Madison watched me walk away and quickly scribbled my warning into a little notebook she carried in her coat pocket. Stick with me here. That ticking time bomb finally went off late next August. A regional medical supply center had just installed a cluster of 6 new Titan generators, acting as the core backup power grid for a massive climate-controlled storage facility packed with fragile medicines and highly sensitive biological products. That Thursday, brutal summer storms completely wiped out the electrical grid across a 60-mile stretch. The Titan units kicked on, right on cue, purring along perfectly for the first few hours. But then the engine temperature started creeping up. 11 hours in, the first machine lost oil pressure, triggering a massive thermal overload warning. By hour 14, 2 more engines followed suit. Pressure tanked, heat spiked, and metal shavings triggered alarms in the secondary filters. 16 hours deep. The main grid was still dead, and those warehouse coolers were draining everything the failing engines had. The entire system totally collapsed. Not just one, but a cascading failure. Every dead motor pushed more strain onto the survivors, until the very last engine finally choked under the crushing demand. When city power finally flickered back on 31 hours later, the warehouse had blown past safe temperature limits for a massive chunk of its life-saving inventory. You and I know the truth. Damages hit 9 figures, and this wasn't their first engine failure. But it was the first disaster with a paper trail too big and too public for their corporate PR machine to bury. The story leaked locally, hit the national industry magazines, and finally exploded across major business networks. Panic hit the boardroom. Alexandra called an emergency Friday session. By morning, she had just 72 hours to figure out why her engines were dying and how to stop the bleeding. Her lead engineering director admitted they desperately needed long-term data on engine failures. Real messy breakdown patterns across multiple machines over the years. But corporate had tossed or buried all those early development records years ago, right when they upgraded their shiny production line. Madison sat quietly across from them both. She finally spoke up, revealing that the most accurate failure logs she was aware of were sitting on dusty shelves in a gritty East Toledo garage. The corporate suite fell dead silent, You know that heavy quiet when the person everyone ignored turns out to be absolutely right, standing right where all the terrible choices were actually made. For a long, painful minute, Alexandra couldn't say a word. Finally, she swallowed her pride and asked for Xavier's number. Xavier was elbow-deep in a 30-year-old farm tractor when she finally pulled up. He didn't rush out to greet her. He took his time finishing the repair, slowly wiping grease off his hands with a dirty shop rag shoved in his pocket. Standing up, he saw the CEO herself in his doorway. Alexandra wore a crisp gray blazer worth more than his entire monthly shop insurance. She was staring at his grease-stained shelves with a look of pure desperation he had never witnessed. Grace was standing quietly at the back counter, running some heavy numbers on a yellow legal pad. Madison hovered right behind the CEO, clutching a laptop and looking like she had rehearsed this exact moment for half her career. The shop absolutely reeked of diesel, baking steel, and that familiar sickly sweet scent of gear fluid. Harsh yellow afternoon sunlight spilled right across the dirty concrete floor. Alexandra started with slick corporate speak. She claimed her business urgently needed his engineering insights and promised a massive, immediate cash payout. Xavier completely ignored the flashy money pitch. Instead, he strolled over to his grimy shelves, touching the little metal numbered tags. He explained that every piece of scrap matched a detailed entry in the greasy logbooks lined up right behind her expensive shoes. He grabbed that first worn-out binder down off the top shelf, flipping straight to the very first broken motor her company had ever dumped there. He read the raw facts without emotion. Uneven heat stress patterns, proving the head gasket could not handle the transfer load. Ruined bearings showing clear sideways shifting during heavy, continuous vibrations. Oil passages completely unable to properly cool down during peak machine operation. He slammed it shut and grabbed another. Let's look at this together. For 6 solid years, he didn't brag or argue. He just read the terminal diagnosis like a mechanic giving you the brutal truth. Alexandra just stood there absorbing it. As the facts piled up, her polished CEO mask slowly began to crack. It was that slow, crushing realization that hits a person when they are finally forced to look at dirty, undeniable proof they can't afford to ignore anymore. Quietly, she asked how long he knew. Xavier looked at her and said he knew for a fact by year 3. You and I both know the lesson here. Corporate ignored it, but he spent 7 years embracing the failure and building the bulletproof engine they couldn't. Listen, simulations never show the real dirt. Madison popped open her laptop right there on my workbench. She pulled up a detailed comparison chart. It matched my greasy repair logs against their corporate warranty claims. The numbers lined up perfectly. You and I could see it. 2 ends of the exact same broken machine. Connor wasn't in the room. He wasn't invited. The chief engineer, hiding away, told us everything we needed to know without anyone saying a single word. CEO Alexandra stared hard at that screen for ages. Then she finally asked what I wanted. I told her I wasn't out for blood. I didn't need some fake corporate apology on my timeline. I just wanted them to admit the design flaw publicly. Stop blaming the customers and actually pay out those warranties. Let real, outside mechanics inspect the factory's current assembly line. And give me fair credit and payment for fixing their mess. Assuming they used my fix in their upcoming engine production. I had one last strict rule. Whatever massive restructuring this company did, they had to protect the floor workers. Those guys just built what they were told. They didn't make the arrogant choices that doomed these machines to fail. Alexandra just stared right at me. You and I know why. She braced for a shakedown, completely unprepared for basic human decency. I made it clear I didn't care about her reputation. I just wanted to keep hundreds of hard-working families from losing their paychecks because rich executives were way too arrogant to hear what their own broken motors were screaming. The official engineering stress test kicked off at the main Pierce laboratory 2 weeks later. The whole room was packed with corporate board members. 3 outside mechanical engineers hired to judge the final test, plus heavy hitters from their 2 largest commercial equipment buyers, and a squad of panicked corporate lawyers trying to contain the warehouse disaster liability. Madison set up the showdown. I only agreed to do it not because I needed any proof, but she warned me that without a massive public demonstration, The suits up top would easily bury my repair data again. We locked 2 identical engines onto test stands side by side. One stock Pimax Titan and one running my custom Walker fix. The plan demanded brutal, heavy-duty operational cycling. Extreme heat pumping filthy dust into the intakes. Burned oil, violent and unpredictable shaking. Built to mimic the rattling abuse of heavy cargo trucks and backup generators running at absolute peak demand. Their factory engine ran smooth at first. Early power numbers looked solid. Even Connor Hayes, who they let watch as long as he kept his mouth shut, seemed to relax. I caught him actually smiling. He thought he was finally safe. I just stood by the blast shield holding my notes. I didn't say a single word for 3 straight hours. We both know the truth. I watched the gauges, waiting for the disaster I'd already fixed 100 times before. My daughter Grace sat in the observation area with her arms crossed, eyes locked on me. At the 4-hour mark, the factory engine's oil temperature started climbing fast, breaking completely away from their projected testing curve. At 5 hours and 40 minutes, the oil pressure gauge started twitching. You and I both know that warning sign. I recognized it from a 9-year-old notebook entry. I quietly pointed it out to Madison. She tapped one of the independent engineers on the shoulder. He stared at the data. He got that dead quiet look, the kind when you realize a terrible truth you can't undo. At 6 hours and 22 minutes, the factory engine gave a harsh metallic knock. The oil pressure plummeted straight down to critical, and the automated safety relays finally killed the power. The room went completely dead. It felt like that heavy silence when something that has been debated forever suddenly stops being an argument and the hard truth takes over. My modified engine just kept humming. Sure, my initial power output numbers were slightly lower. I had purposefully traded away a tiny fraction of peak horsepower to completely rebuild the thermal management setup. But my temperature curve stayed dead flat, oil pressure rock steady. There was barely any metal debris caught in my filters. An independent tech actually asked me why I sacrificed that peak efficiency just for extra durability. I told him industrial motors don't break down inside clean laboratories. They die out in the mud when a guy has absolutely no backup plan and cannot wait for a corporate service tech. Building a motor just to pass a spec sheet is making a promise. A motor still running 17 hours into a massive power outage is actually keeping one. Connor tried brushing the whole test off as a fluke without any long-term proof. Madison calmly placed a bound copy of my 10-year data log right on the table in front of the chairman. The chairman picked up the thick binder and didn't put it down for a long time. CEO Alexandra Pierce stood up at the front once the formal testing session finally wrapped up. She had some prepared remarks, but she spoke without that slick polish she usually brought. And her stumbling words were the most genuine thing anyone in that boardroom had ever heard from her. She admitted Pierce Motors had made a massive systematic error. Not just a manufacturing mistake or a service flaw, but a fundamental failure of knowledge. A complete breakdown in understanding what they actually needed to pay attention to. She confessed they treated every broken part as a PR problem to hide rather than a lesson. Stick with me here. If they just listened, this catastrophe never would have cost them so much over the years. She stared right at me when she said that last part. She spoke plainly without any of that corporate spin that CEOs usually use to say sorry without actually admitting they were completely wrong. Think about it. The company wasn't destroyed by rival brands or tough market conditions. It died believing the mechanics closest to its failures had absolutely nothing useful to teach the executives above them. My little girl Grace just watched me. I stood right beside my test engine, the only one still running. It hummed perfectly steady in that quiet room, and I kept one bare hand resting firmly against its warm metal housing. Not with triumph. Not for show. More like how you touch something you've spent years trying to figure out and finally understand. My daughter grew up watching folks treat me like scenery, like basic infrastructure, a glorified waste disposal service. She saw me absorb all that treatment without ever breaking, without growing bitter, never letting the world's low opinion of me infect my actual work. Standing in that test bay at 18, she finally understood that what she had witnessed in our garage throughout her childhood wasn't just poverty. It was a kind of relentless drive. A quiet competence the world mistook for smallness, simply because I wasn't performing for an audience. Connor Hayes got slapped with administrative suspension the following week. An internal review wrapped up within 60 days, ending his time at the company. The corporate investigation proved that he had, over a span of several years, ordered the field service team to blame engine failures entirely on customer misuse. He'd hidden Madison's failure analysis reports from the engineering leadership chain and slashed material specs across 2 consecutive production cycles just to hit short-term profit margins. Reductions that the official record showed were clearly flagged as structurally dangerous by at least 2 engineers on the corporate team. Those warnings magically disappeared from the final specification drafts submitted to the executive board. He walked away without public comment. Pierce included these investigation results inside the official disclosure documents they filed with their insurance carriers and the state attorneys general handling the massive pharmaceutical warehouse lawsuit. Meanwhile, the CEO, Alexandra, spent months stuck in rooms very different from her usual executive suites. She sat directly across from angry customers who lost money, and sometimes whole operations, because they trusted her power equipment. She sat through grueling regulatory hearings. She faced shareholder meetings where people didn't ask about growth projections. They demanded real accountability. She answered them all, not well. See, when you've spent 20 years controlling the narrative, the urge to spin runs deep. You and I both know how that game works. But eventually, that corporate instinct gave way to something completely functional, which was the hard realization that the only way out of this massive damage was straight through, not around. She launched a massive warranty repair program and publicly disclosed the technical review's full findings. And she signed a formal consulting agreement with me, on terms exactly as I had demanded back in my messy little garage. The new operation we created was called Walker Reliability Lab, an independent technical unit specializing in real-world durability testing for heavy industrial power equipment. I specifically structured it to stay entirely separate from Pierce's internal engineers. I stayed a contractor, never an employee. That distinction mattered to me in ways I wouldn't explain. But honestly, everyone around me totally understood. My lab's new methodology wasn't overly sophisticated by academic standards. It was rooted in the exact same approach I'd been quietly practicing for a decade. I always pushed those machines way past whatever the blueprints assumed. I'd track what really broke, finding that gap between specs and cold reality. Then we fixed the actual design, instead of just tweaking the paperwork. Madison Reed became my daily link between our grimy lab and Pierce's engineers. She dove right into it. She had that fire of someone who knew she was right for years, and finally got the green light to do something about it. My daughter Grace put off college for a solid year to turn wrenches with me, right before starting her mechanical engineering degree the next fall. A choice I accepted with a very deep quiet pride, the kind that made me buy her a real drafting table and some high-end measuring tools I spent 2 whole nights picking out at the supply shop. The big boss, Alexandra, showed up at my garage again that October during our first year working together. She drove up completely alone, no PR team, no corporate agenda. She stepped through my door and just stood in the very shop she had spent 10 years treating like a worthless graveyard for broken scrap. My old shelves were still there, same numbered logbooks on the wall, even though our setup grew and I had to move the older engine teardowns into a brand new storage bay I built on the lot next door. Grace was working at her bench. She was all grown up, and when she finally looked up from her current project, she locked eyes with Alexandra. It was a cold, direct look that proved she remembered every insult and chose exactly how to handle it. Alexandra actually apologized to my daughter before saying another word. Not some fake PR spin, not a lawyer-approved corporate statement. She told Grace she was genuinely sorry she grew up hearing people talk about me the way those executives always had. She admitted she was one of the loudest voices treating me like a joke, and confessed she was dead wrong. Grace did not tell her it was okay. She fired back with something that CEO will remember forever. She told her I never just collected other people's garbage. I just knew what those failed machines were actually worth long before anyone else even bothered looking. You and I know trust is hard. They spent 2 years rebuilding theirs. Not with flashy ads, but pure tested reliability. That massive Pimex turbine retrofitted with my own stabilizer assembly, and rebuilt to the exact specs we forced out of our brutal testing lab. Finally worked in the field without bursting into the disasters of its older versions. Every new motor design they handed my lab for testing before launch started showing a totally different, manageable failure rate. We caught more flaws early on in my shop before they ever became public disasters. The standard shifted quietly, no applause needed. Because it was the only way forward once we all finally stopped pretending those fancy boardroom theories actually worked. I finally paid off my garage. Fixed the damn roof, which had been dripping down the north wall for 3 miserable winters. I got Grace a nice desk for her place when college started. A beautiful heavy wood one with drawers that actually glided open smoothly. But I kept that faded hand-painted sign above my door. You and I should look at that faded brownish-gray Walker garage sign. That's exactly where this whole story started. Because that weathered sign hung right there when the very first truck reversed in, hauling broken engines and a heavy unseen cargo of corporate arrogance. It stayed bolted up there when the same massive company that sent those trucks came crawling back for help. The name on the board never meant anything fancy, just plain honest work. Late autumn on a quiet Thursday evening, Xavier was teaching. A handful of sharp engineering kids from the nearby technical college stood in a tight half circle around a torn-down engine block. They listened closely as he read the bearing failure pattern. He wasn't faking his expertise, just doing what he always did, listening closely to what the busted metal was saying, and then passing that truth along. He spoke slow, pointing a single grease-stained finger at certain gouges on the bearing surface. The kids leaned in exactly the way people do when they learn a hard lesson they will never forget. Alexandra stood by the big roll-up bay door, waiting on a chat that could definitely wait. She watched a young student ask Xavier how he managed to spot the catastrophic design flaws that a room full of corporate engineers missed for 10 whole years. Xavier stayed quiet for a beat, studying the ruined bearing in his palm. He simply said he never tried to prove he was smarter than the suits upstairs. He just refused to scrap the broken parts that were desperately trying to speak. Stick with me. Look at that shelf in the corner behind the neat part bins. Sat a scarred piston from the very first motor Pierce Industrial Motors dumped on his lot. Its top was black with heavy carbon scoring. The ringland was cracked in a very specific way, proving the cooling system gave out completely at the absolute worst possible second. Xavier never tossed it in the scrap pile. Never sold it off, never hid it away in a dark box out of sight. It rested up there like a monument to the hard-earned wisdom you only get as a person willing to keep the exact garbage the wealthy bosses decided was totally worthless. Every single kid who walked through his shop eventually asked. Xavier always gave the same answer. That busted piece of metal on the bench had once been dismissed as proof of a cheap mistake, and it turned out to be the opening line to a story about what real truth costs and where it hides. A fancy blueprint is just a promise. Survival is the truth that time eventually proves. For 10 long years, Xavier kept the exact truth a greedy company threw in the trash. He logged it all in oily notebooks lined up on numbered shelves, in torn-down motor parts lined up exactly how they rolled in. He didn't save the junk to build a massive lawsuit. He kept it because he firmly believed that broken machines deserved to be understood. Figuring out why they died was the whole point. The guys upstairs hide their failures to protect the stock price. Let's remember this. The wise keep failure close so they survive the crash.